Hello, good evening, everyone. A very happy new year to you. Today, we welcome you to a CME on embryonic factors to improve IVF success rates and IVF lab KPIs. This is a joint effort by Nagpur Test Tube Baby Center and Cooper Surgical as a knowledge partner. I would want to introduce you to the convener of today's session, Dr. Sadhna Patwardhan. She is MD Gynec and obstetrician and director of Nagpur Test Tube Baby Center. She is a senior consultant and obstetrician and gynecologist, Dr. Ketkar Hospital and Research Center, Dr. Center Nagpur. She is a faculty for ISAR C Create and also faculty for JNMC Savangi Vardha ART Department. She has been clinical secretary Maharashtra State Chapter ISAR 2018 and 2020. She is the chairperson High Risk Pregnancy Committee AMOGS, National Executive Member Fertility Preservation Society of India, member FOXY Infertility Committee, Executive Member Association of Medical Women in India, Nagpur branch, member of ISAR, ESHRE, GESI, PCF Society of India. Her research interests include recurrent implantation failure, ovarian stimulation protocol in poor responders, team member, pre-LGEM study, Yuli Bristol for fibroids, presented papers and invited as faculty member at various national and international conferences, conducted and organized various CME and workshops on ultrasonography and infertility, center recognized by FOXY for basic and advanced infertility training since last 20 years. The awards she has received are she is a gold medalist in the graduate and postgraduate study, Best Paper Award at World Congress Mumbai 1999, Dr. C.L. Zaveri Award Foxy 2000, Dr. S.D. Khandwala Best Paper Award. Very welcome, Dr. Sadhna. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah. Good evening and a warm welcome to everybody. And I'm indeed delighted to hold this CME on the embryonic factors to improve the IVF success rates and the key performance indicators in IVF. Opening up of human conception in vitro was perhaps amongst the first examples of any applied science in modern high tech. Human IVF, as we all know, has spread throughout the world. And as the statistics go, more than 3.5 million babies were born way back in the last decade itself. There is an increasing need for lots of couples to take up IVF, and this, as we all know, is growing year after year. And now we all know that there are major advances in genetic technologies, and now we are able to identify hundreds of genes in a single cell and also diagnose genetic diseases in the embryos. So practicing IVF today for a clinician is teaching us a lot of understanding of the desire and love for children, a love for the partner, and its giving joys of parenthood. We today are still enmeshed in a field embracing fundamental evolution from the stages of oocyte to blastocyst and implantation. And this is a very enigmatic field, the success rate, the implantation rate, the take home baby rate, the clinical pregnancy rate have almost, reached a status quo. And we always need to go up on these implantation rates and the clinical pregnancy rate. And so that is the motto behind organizing today's CME on the embryonic factors affecting the implantation and, of course, key performance indicators in the lab. We have eminent faculty and we have eminent chairpersons. For the first scientific session on embryonic factors to improve IVF success rates, we have Dr. Darshana Pawar and Dr. Bindu Chimote from our own city of Oranges, Nagpur. Dr. Darshana Pawar is a dear friend. She is a diploma in reproductive medicine from Australia. She's practicing IVF in Nagpur since last 1.5 decade. She's worked at Royal Hospital Muscat, which was a tertiary care center in obstetrics and gynecology for 14 years. She's been a senior registrar in Hutt Valley Hospital, Wellington, New Zealand for 2 years. She was a senior registrar in Royal Women's Hospital in Melbourne, IVF, Australia for 4 years. Darshana came back to Nagpur in 2007 10 and has set up a state-of-art Central India Fertility Center and a well-women clinic. And it has all the facilities which can be offered to infertility patients. So, and our next chairperson is our very own Dr. Bindu Chimote. Bindu is a great academician, a hardcore embryologist, and a true academician. Bindu has presented more than 17 original research papers as first author and 43 as co-author at ESHRE and ASRM. She has won the Best Paper in Travel Training Award at ASRM 2013 and Best Poster Video Award at ASRM 2019. She has published 8 original research papers in international journals. She's a reviewer for international journals on reproductive biology and endocrinology and Journal of Assisted Reproduction. She's contributed 14 chapters to national and international books on infertility. And her major thrust area of research are follicular fluid metabolics, endometrial receptivity, and reproductive endocrinology. So we have a fantastic choice of chairperson for an eminent speaker, Dr. Deepak Modi, in the first scientific session, and I request the chairpersons to take the CME forward. Over to you, Dr. Darshana and Dr. Bindu.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sadhna, for the wonderful introduction. And it is indeed an honor that we have to introduce Dr. Deepak Modi. I think one of the best India or the world has seen so far. Bindu?
I think you can go ahead. You can go ahead introducing. Yeah.
Right. So Dr. Deepak Modi is a PhD in human genetics. He is presently a scientist at ICMR National Institute for Research in Reproductive Health and heads the Molecular and Cellular Biology Group. He is recipient of many awards. So I'm not going to enumerate those because I would like to have more time with Dr. Modi when he's talking. He has more than 85 publications at several prestigious national and international journals. And his current research areas are understanding of endometrial receptivity and endometrial disorders, which of course is a nightmare for all clinicians when the patient does not conceive, factors governing embryo development in implantation, genetics of sexual development and male infertility, and COVID-19 and reproduction, which is still a blank area in the world today. He is also a co-investigator of the PrEG-COVID registry, which collects information on pregnant and women with COVID-19. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Deepak Modi, and look ahead to a wonderful session from you, as always.
Thank you so much, Dr. Darshana and Dr. Bindu. It's been an immense pleasure to be here. I'm thankful to Dr. Sadhna, who has invited me on the beginning of the new year. So we begin a new year with a happy note. We hope that the new year allows us to meet in person. I really missed the Nagpur meetings and Nagpur barfis and the oranges. So let's hope that this year at least, we all should be able to meet physically. And without much ado, I would like to start, and I hope my screen gets visible. Is my presentation seen, please?
Not yet.
Not yet?
No, not yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have to do share screen. Okay, start broadcast. Is it visible now?
No, it's gone off again.
You'll need to share your screen.
There is something wrong with my device.
By the way, am I audible now?
Yeah, Bindu, you are.
Okay. And no echo.
There is echo, but it's okay. Come closer to your screen.
Is this visible now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. So
Yes, it's visible now.
Thank you so much. So I thought I'll speak on a topic which is very close to my heart. At the beginning of the new year, I would love to talk about the science that I've been doing for last 15 years or so in my lab, and how the work that we have done is translated into some of the information that's been very useful clinically, and how from very basic research that we have done, that we have now reached a stage where we can look at clinical trials and assess how we can improve success rates of IVF. So as I've been introduced by Dr. Darshana, and you all know that my lab is interested in multiple aspects of reproductive health, and our major focus has been understanding of embryo implantation. So when we talk about embryo implantation, I don't have to really go through the details of it, but we know that it requires a receptive endometrium. And the endometrial receptivity is achieved by our favorite hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And we use modulators of estrogen and progesterone day in and out to improve receptivity or as contraceptive agents. Having said that, this entire business of estrogen and progesterone and the endometrial receptivity is based on the fact that if you give estrogen and progesterone to in animals which are overectomized, you can induce implantation and pregnancy. And this suggested that estrogen and progesterone are sufficient to induce receptivity in the endometrium and allow the embryo to implant. And currently, the textbooks teach us that a receptive endometrium is just a passive tissue where the embryo is to just come and implant. And if you look at it, most of us actually truly believe it. And there is no reason for not to believe it, because there's been enough data around to say that the receptivity, once the receptivity is achieved, pregnancy could be achieved. However, when I started my lab several years ago, we challenged this notion and we asked that, is receptive endometrium just sufficient, or is there anything additional required for pregnancy to occur? However, this actually arose from clinical observations, where now using very high quality hormones, absolutely optimized culture conditions, we have reached up to very beautiful blastocyst stage cultures. We have reached a point where we can even look at the embryos growing continuously to the morphokinetic devices. And also when we are also able to look at the embryonic genome. Today we can even look at the embryonic transcriptome, embryonic proteome, the embryonic metabolome, and we know how to judge a good quality embryo. And we are continuously improving our efforts on that. However, irrespective of whatever is done at the embryonic side, for the last 2 decades, the pregnancy rates haven't really improved significantly. We have invested a lot towards the embryonic side, but what we have forgotten is to understand the endometrium, because we believe that a receptive endometrium is sufficient to induce pregnancy. Irrespective that we do, pregnancy rates just do not seem to improve when we transfer high quality euploid embryos in the receptive endometrium. So we know that on a receptive endometrium, we require the embryo to appose. The embryo has to then undergo an attachment reaction and the invasion processes. And what we discovered through our work was that during this course of apposition to attachment and invasion phases, the endometrium undergoes several modifications. This data is from the mouse, where you can see that in a receptive endometrium, we looked at this protein called as OVGP1, oviductal glycoprotein 1, and we found that it is not at all expressed in the receptive endometrium in a receptive endometrium. However, when there is a presence of the embryo, the protein OVGP1 suddenly comes up in the endometrium. Look at the endometrial epithelial lumen, and you can see this beautiful red staining coming up there. You can see it's only coming in the receptive endometrium at the time of implantation. Another protein, E-cadherin, this data is in the mouse. You can see the embryo is sitting here, and there is beautiful staining of E-cadherin only when there is presence of embryo. You do not see this protein in a receptive endometrium. So this told us that in presence of the embryo, the endometrium can undergo modification. This was in the mouse. We have also done several studies in the primates, the monkeys specifically, where we took monkeys which were in the receptive stage or in the receptive stage where there was presence of an embryo. The animals underwent rounds of mating, and we knew that there was a presence of the embryo just prior to implantation. And we could see numerous histological changes like proliferation of the endometrial epithelium, here. You can see this protein hoxetin in the stroma and the epithelium. Look at this in presence of the embryo here. The expression of the protein is severely going up. MUC1 is an anti-adhesive molecule. It is present abundantly in the receptive endometrium, but when there is presence of embryo, there is downregulation of MUC1. This is from my colleague's lab, Dr. Kitanjali. And integrin, which is there in the receptive endometrium, but look at its levels go up so much only in presence of the embryo. So these results told us that in a receptive endometrium, the embryo induces several changes there. And we have summarized this work very recently, and we know that in presence of the embryo, the endometrial epithelium undergoes expansion. There is increased angiogenesis in the endometrium in presence of the embryo. There is a change in immune cell profile, and the stromal cells undergo decidualization. And there are a whole lot of changes occurring in the gene expression. So this data, and based on this, we have proposed that embryo implantation is a three-step process. We say that a receptive endometrium is necessary, which is driven by the hormones, is necessary but not sufficient to drive embryo implantation. A receptive endometrium undergoes several changes in presence of the embryo, and we call this as embryo-driven changes in the endometrium, which will allow embryo apposition. And once the embryo apposes, it will undergo implantation and decidualization-driven changes, then further aid the embryo to complete its process of implantation. So a receptive endometrium is necessary, but not sufficient to initiate pregnancy. And the embryo-derived signals prime a receptive endometrium to initiate implantation. If you want to read more about this, we have this review which was published in Endocrinology in 2018. It is available free online. It is called as Embryo Implantation War in Times of Love. You can go through the details of it. But over the years, when we published this work, parallelly, people started thinking that when the woman is infertile or when the embryo is unable to implant, could it be that because we are not giving sufficient time to the embryo and the endometrium to crosstalk, and therefore, in many cases, the pregnancy is failing is because the endometrium is not yet well prepared. It is like, you can imagine a house where guests are expected to come. Now, if the guests tell you well in advance and we put the house in order, we cook good food, we prepare everything to welcome the guests, and that requires sufficient amount of time. Now, in an IVF setup specifically, we are not giving that sufficient amount of time for the endometrium to prepare and get signals that, okay, there are something that is expected to come in there. So the way around about to that was that before the process of embryo transfer, if we instill substances inside the uterus, intrauterine installation of substances can be done to which can mimic the embryo. And by this, the uterus can be tricked that, okay, you are expected an embryo within the next couple of hours, or maybe next within a day. And then we do the embryo transfer and see if pregnancy rates can be improved. Now, over the last several years, studies have been done. Traditionally, studies were done using embryo culture fluid. Then people started using platelet-rich plasma. There is a GCSF or GM-CSF which is being used. There is HCG which has been used. And more recently, there's embryo glue or hyaluronic acid, which has been used as substances which can trick the endometrium to believe that there is an embryo coming in. The changes occur there, and then the pregnancy rates are evaluated. What I'm going to do is cover up all the data that is available till known. We will only look at RCTs, and I've only chosen these molecules because there is clean data available. There are clean RCTs done, and there are either Cochrane reviews or systematic reviews or meta-analysis done. So other smaller substances where there is not enough mention has not been covered in today's presentation. So the logic of using blastocyst culture medium is understandable because it is in the culture medium, the embryo will throw out all the substances, the signals which it should send to the endometrium. So if we infuse blastocyst culture medium, can we improve the pregnancy rates? Now, people have done day 5 frozen thawed culture medium, about 20 microliters was infused in the endometrium on the day or 2 days prior to embryo transfer. There are a lot of variables in there. People have done batch cultures or the single embryo cultures. The volume of culture fluid has been highly variable across studies. And people have typically done this in frozen cycles. This is a systematic review which has been done. there are three randomized controlled trials done, one by our own Dr. Mohan Kamath. And we can see here that when we look at the odds ratio, so typically when we look at it, you have favors control. So either you put a saline or no saline transfusion, or you can use the embryo culture fluid. And when we look at these plots, you can see here that this is the data which would favor embryo culture fluid, and this is the data which would favor control. And you can see that one study, there is a marginal improvement in pregnancy rates. In Mohan's study, in fact, it was the control who had slightly better pregnancy rates than the embryo transfer fluid. And the cumulative odds ratio is 1, relative risk is 1, which indicates that there is no major influence. Pregnancy rates cannot improve in women undergoing IVF by putting blastocyst culture medium. Of course, there are many, many issues to this. These are only 2 studies, and these are unselected infertile women. There are no specific studies done on different conditions. The next thing that we will discuss is intrauterine installation of platelet-rich plasma. The logic here is that platelet-rich plasma would have a whole bunch of activated platelets. And in response to platelets, a lot of tissues produce a lot of cytokines, growth factors, like TGF-beta, platelet growth factor, epidermal growth factor. And all of these can regulate cell migration, cell invasion, proliferation, differentiation, promote growth of extracellular matrix. So it is expected to make you the tissues better, and it should help in trophoblast invasion. This is a RCT on clinical pregnancy rates. This was published earlier in 2020. And there are about 6 studies or 7 studies here where they have compared PRP in women with and without PRP. And here you see the data that the clinical pregnancy rates seem to be about 1.5 times better in some studies. One study did not see any major improvement in clinical pregnancy rates, but the 3 other studies have done. And if we take the cumulative relative risk of clinical pregnancy rates in women injected with PRP, it's about 1.79. I must remind you here that most of these studies are very low quality data coming because they're not blinded. The sample size is much lower. You can see there is 12 there are 12 women, there are 27 women, there are 15 women, 20 women. It's not a large sample size, but the total data available till date is about 311. And they're seen in PRP group about 314 from the control group. And you can see that there seems to be some increase in pregnancy rates in response to PRP. However, we must remember that these women are not subgrouped. There is a lot of variability also in the timing of infusion, the amount of infusion. And please remember that platelet-rich plasma is highly variable, although it is autologous, but it is based on patient's health condition, what the patient has been previously exposed to. And even the preparations are very tough to do, and therefore it's not something which is kind of a favored thing because you require a whole lot of laboratory setup to prepare the PRP. A very famous molecule, GCSF, I think with Dr. Sadhna, we had the first interaction when she presented her GCSF data. It is a cytokine. It is produced locally by endothelial cells, monocytes, and in the endometrial cells. As the name says that it is important for granulocyte proliferation, differentiation, and migration. It mainly helps in mobilization of immune cells, but in the endometrium, it's thought to facilitate angiogenesis, decrease cell death, and reduce apoptotic activity. And it also helps in immunomodulation by affecting lymphocytes, macrophages, T helper cells, etc. There's this very beautiful study done in the mouse, done in the rat model of thin endometrium. It was published in August last year. And what they did was they made a mouse model where they infused some amount of ethanol into the endometrium of the rat so that it's a model for thin endometrium. And here you can see this is control, no treatment. This is GCSF treatment in the normal endometrium, and here it is in the thin endometrium. What these authors showed was that when you inject GCSF locally into the endometrium of mice, there is some increase in proliferation. There is no major change. But if you inject it in mice with thin endometrium, the endometrial epithelium expands. There's a lot of proliferative activity occurring in the endometrial epithelium. in response to GCSF. They also looked at angiogenic markers, and in normal endometrium, there is no major change in angiogenic markers, but angiogenesis improves significantly when GCSF is injected in rats with thin endometrium. This indicates that probably in women with thin endometrium, GCSF may have a significant role in increasing the proliferative capability of the endometrial cells, improving angiogenesis, and probably also local immunomodulation. Let us look at the clinical trials which have been done using intrauterine instillation of GCSF. And this is unselected population, the first bar here. And you can see that pregnancy rates do not seem to be any better in unselected population. The RR is just 1.1 in women injected intrauterine instillation with or without GCSF. However, in women with more than 2 IVF failures, that is recurrent implantation failures, there seems to be a significant improvement in pregnancy rates. The RR is more than 2. That means there's 50% chance that the pregnancy rates would improve. That there's a 2 times chance that the pregnancy rates would be better in response to intrauterine instillation of GCSF. And this seems to be fairly common across all the studies. And here you can see in women with thin endometrium, there are 2 studies which suggest that there could be an improvement, but the other 2 studies do not show a major improvement. And the RR is 1.58. This is a Cochrane review done again by Mohan and very beautifully done. It shows that if you look at this data, at least in case of 2 IVF failures, more than 2 IVF failures. Many studies have very good quality data, but some of the studies still have moderate to low quality data coming out of it. But the numbers are fairly high here. And it seems that GCSF can improve pregnancy rates in women with IVF failures. But remember, again, that more studies are required from different parts of the world. These are still very limited numbers of studies of 300 and 320. Sorry, the numbers are only 300 and 320, 315 and 328 here. So GCSF may improve clinical pregnancy rates in a subset of patients with recurrent IVF failures. Probably it's not going to help in unselected general population or in women with thin endometrium. But again, we must remember thin endometrium, there is very little data available. Coming to my favorite molecule, HCG, we know HCG is produced by the trophic-dermal cells of the embryo. And we and others have shown that HCG plays a significant role in immunomodulation. It helps in stromal cell decidualization. It also helps in angiogenesis, production of LIF and glycodelin, so on and so forth. This is a very beautiful study done by my collaborator, Professor Aski Fasli-Abbas, and where they have actually taken endometrial biopsies of women who were intrauterine infused with HCG. So they were given HCG, the women were given 500 IU of HCG, and after 2 days, endometrial biopsy was done. And the first thing they did was endometrial receptivity array. And they found that by infusing HCG, there was no major change in endometrial receptivity. However, if you see here, there is increase in expression of estrogen receptors. There is increase in expression of progesterone receptors. This is immunohistochemistry. You can see this. You look at the control endometrium, the endometrium of women without any treatment. This is endometrium of women treated with HCG, and you can see beautiful increase in expression of estrogen receptors in the stroma. In the glands, progesterone receptors increase in stroma and the glands, which is indicative of decidualization. Notch1 is a protein which is required for embryo endometrial interactions, and you can see a tremendous increase in Notch1 for which aids in decidualization and embryo endometrial interaction. C3 is a complement factor which is increased significantly in women who are given HCG. This data together implies that infusion of HCG brings about a whole lot of changes in the endometrium, in the human endometrium, which is coordinating towards endometrial receptivity. And what Dr. Aski says is that it helps in actually synchronizing the stroma and the gland differentiation, which is required for embryo implantation. So HCG induces pre-decidua-like changes in the uterine stroma in preparation to implantation. And when we compare the data of the monkeys with the endometrium, in which we have looked at the embryo, and when Aski looks at the data in humans with the HCG, there is a lot of similarity indicating that actually it's a HCG which is probably helping the local growth of endometrium towards implantation. And there are lots of clinical trials done with intrauterine installation of HCG. And here we can see that clinical pregnancy rates our live birth rates are here. This is the first one is a live birth rate. And there is a twofold increase in live birth rate in women who are injected with intrauterine installation of HCG. Clinical pregnancy rates are also around 1.9, which is very close to 2. When we look at a lot of subgrouping has been done in this because a large numbers of trials available, subgrouping has been done. And it has been shown that if the cleavage stage embryo is injected with less than 500 IU of HCG, there is no major improvement in pregnancy rates. But in studies where 500 IU of HCG was injected and cleavage stage embryos were transferred, there is almost a 1.5-fold increase in clinical pregnancy rates. But if blastocysts were transferred with 500 IU of HCG, there is no major improvement in clinical pregnancy rates. These results tell us that it is the dosage and the timing of infusion of molecules in the uterine cavity is necessary to determine what would be the success rates of various molecules. And in HCG, it seems like that the best results could come if we would inject HCG and do a cleavage stage transfer and not a blastocyst transfer. So we could achieve good pregnancy rates by intrauterine installation of HCG with cleavage stage and 500 IU of HCG. This data is coming about from more than 1,000 women, so there is significantly a good statistical correlation here. However, again, we must remember that all this data is very moderate quality, high quality data, very good clinical trials, RCTs are still missing. When it comes to live birth rates, again, the same thing. Cleavage stage embryos with the 500 IU of HCG seems to give the best outcome here. You can see this data is here. 1.5-fold increase in pregnancy rates in women who are in live birth rates in women who are injected with 500 of HCG followed by cleavage stage transfers. And many people thought that there is increase in miscarriage rates because a lot of embryos just randomly keep on implanting. But cumulative data suggests that there is no major change in miscarriage rates in response to, response to HCG injection. The RR is just 1.14, that 1.04. That means it does not either favor HCG nor it favors controls. And here we can see that there is no major effect on no major effect of HCG on miscarriage rates. This is data which has been kindly shared by Krishna and Dr. Durga Rao, and they've compared in a small subset of cases GCSF and HCG, and they've found that the clinical pregnancy rates seem to be identical with HCG and GCSF injection. That means you can take a choice what you want to inject, but again, remember, most of these are blastocyst stage transfers. The miscarriage rates are slightly lower in HCG as compared to GCSF, but I don't think these are statistically significant. And of course, the data size is much smaller. Do I have time? Can I discuss about hyaluronic acid, or I'm done?
You can go on, Deepak, I think so, with the
Okay, so I'll take about 5 more minutes.
Yeah.
Coming to hyaluronic acid, this is something which has been a synthetic media which has been developed where there is hyaluronic acid added into the embryo culture medium or into, and it's the specific amounts of this added. There are various brands available. It's, I mean, the common understanding is the embryo glue. The logic here is that hyaluronic acid is produced by the embryo locally, and it changes the uterine epithelium, and it brings out, it dissolutes a lot of molecules which are not required, like MUC1, and a whole lot of glycoproteins can be degraded by hyaluronic acid, and by its process it can help in sticking the embryo to the endometrium. A lot of studies have been done with hyaluronic acid. One of the study has been done by our own Sayali here. Her study is put here with 55 women, and there is 29 women in the control arm. And there are a lot of studies similarly done by various groups. And here we can see that the cumulative data does not seem to be very, very promising, although some studies have shown improvements in pregnancy rates, but cumulative data of about 2,000 women in both the arms, there doesn't seem to be a major improvement in response to hyaluronic acid instillation as compared to the controls. But this is, again, I think, live birth rates. This paper, this is a Cochrane review, which was published by Vidal's group in August, or I think it came in November 2020. And here you can see that live birth rates are RR is 2.12. The miscarriage rates seem to be slightly lower, but there is not much difference. Again, it's not statistically significant. Clinical pregnancy rates with high versus low or no hyaluronic acid is 1.16. Multiple pregnancy rates somehow seem to be slightly higher with hyaluronic acid, and adverse events, however, are not significantly different between the two groups. Remember, none of these are statistically significant. The patient numbers are fairly high in most of these studies, but most of the data is either moderate quality or low quality, and we do not have yet good clinical trials with even hyaluronic acid or enriched medium. So just to summarize this data here, PRP, live birth rates, most of the people have not reported. Clinical pregnancy rates seem to be slightly higher with PRP infusion, but there is no data on implantation rate, and the miscarriage rate is slightly lower. Coming to embryo culture fluid, there is no evidence to suggest that embryo culture fluid has any influence on clinical pregnancy rates or implantation rates or birth rates. But remember, the data is very low quality, and only 3 studies are available in this direction. Very good planned studies needs to be done here. The limitation here is the amount of culture fluid available, the amount of the kind of batch cultures done. And because embryos also could be euploid, aneuploid, it probably is not really making major difference. Again, hyaluronic acid enriched medium. There is no evidence to suggest that it has any major improvements in pregnancy rates. But GCSF and HCG are 2 molecules of which HCG seems to be performing slightly better over GCSF in improving live birth rates. The clinical pregnancy rates, however, seem to be fairly similar. Implantation rates are higher in women injected with the HCG, but it does not change miscarriage rates, although miscarriage rates with GCSF seem to be slightly lower. Remember, most of these studies have the limitation that most of the studies are done on unselected group of women randomly chosen. There are no subgrouping analysis done, and probably the way we are treating that one size should fit all does not seem to be the ideal way of doing these kinds of studies. We need to develop neat protocols and identify women in whom this may be beneficial now, and then probably conduct next set of randomized control trials to see where we can have good quality data. Remember, all the data that we have spoken about is low to medium quality. There are hardly any high quality studies. There is significantly risk of bias because none of these studies are blinded, and specifically for clinical trials, double-blind studies are the only gold standards available today to have good quality data available. And except for HCG, most of the data is for less than 1,000 women, and therefore one has to be cautious. But as I said, that we need to first define now based on this data that which group of patients, at least for HCG, we know that probably irrespective of the patient history, 500 IU of HCG at the cleavage stage could be one of the best ways of improving pregnancy rates, but yet we have not done much of subgroup analysis there. So the take-home message is intrauterine infusion of PRP or GCSF or HCG can have modest effects on improving pregnancy rates, but I'm happy with this that both HCG and GCSF can at least improve the birth rates by 1.5 to 2 times. But we need good quality, unbiased, multicentric clinical trials to be recommended in routine clinical practice. But I'm happy because what we started about 20 years ago saying that the embryo should induce changes, and these changes are necessary for good pregnancy outcomes. And here we see that in women actually done in large-scale clinical trials, this data seems to be fairly promising. It's just a matter of time that we get together and actually do good clinical trials with good clinical practice. I think we should be able to modulate endometrium for improving pregnancy rates. And I will stop here. I thank my group, my students, specifically Nancy and Richa, who work hard to understand our understanding of embryo implantation, and they are the ones who are looking at various aspects of embryo-induced changes in the endometrium. And I thank ICMR, DBT, DST, and CSIR for a whole lot of funding. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions whenever they wish it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Deepak, for a very crisp, precise, and yet a very comprehensive lecture. And I must really appreciate that in spite of being a thorough researcher, you have restricted yourself to very practical aspects of the embryonic factors rather than bombarding us with an array of cytokines and growth factors and all. So it is really, really very commendable. And we'll continue probably the question and answer after the second session is over. So we go forward.
Okay, thank you, chairpersons, and thank you, Dr. Deepak. It's always indeed a pleasure to listen to you and, your whole range of research activities, the way you go about them and the way you present the data, Just to tell the audience, we are also doing with Deepak an IVF and COVID study also. We have published this. Padma Rekha is the first author of this study, and we have published this data in the Journal of Human and Assisted Reproduction, this issue. So thank you, Deepak, and thank you, chairpersons. And now we move over to the second scientific session, and I invite my junior embryologist, Rushita Vaghasia, to introduce the chairpersons for the next scientific session. Over to Rushita, please.
Good evening, everyone. I welcome to all on behalf of Nagpur Test Baby Center. I am very much honored to introduce our chairperson, Dr. Jayesh Amin sir. Dr. Jayesh Amin sir. He is Secretary of Gujarat chapter. He is infertility and IVF specialist at Wings IVF. He has completed MBBS and MD from MP Shah Medical College, Jamnagar. He received fellowship for IVF and embryology for Lars Johnson, Sweden. He is also certified infertility trainer. Dr. Amin has been awarded for excellence in infertility treatment by then Union Health Minister, and he is received Game Changer of the Year Best Award at National Fertility Awards 2019. Dr. Jayesh Amin is the clinical director of Wings IVF Group, which has presence across Ahmedabad, Rajkot, Surat, and Udaipur. I can go on and on to describe your merits, but I move to our another chairperson, Dr. Vijay Mangoli sir. Dr. Vijay Mangoli sir is a lab director of fertility clinic at Mumbai. He has associated with Human IVF since 1986. He is Secretary General of ISAR from 2010 to 12. He is also chairperson of Embryology ISAR 2014 to 2016. He published 21 papers in peer-reviewed journals, many guest lectures through national and international conferences, and he has contributed 49 chapters in medical references in books. And Dr. Vijay Mangoli is also recipient of Lifeline Achievement Award through ISAR 2017. It's pleasure to introduce your contribution among the likely audience. Now over to respected chairperson to take the scientific program forward.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, doctor.
Okay. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you, Dr. Sadhna, for inviting me. It is always a pleasure to participate in the CMEs that is being conducted by. And today's CMEs I truly appreciate, because one is Deepak is there with us, and he has really highlighted many small aspects, and then he has given us a highlight that it is not only the embryo quality that is important to give the pregnancies, but it has made us, all the clinicians, thinking that how the endometrium is also equally important in getting the pregnancies. And second is, right now Rajvi is going to talk on the KPIs aspect of it. KPIs are obviously, as far as the laboratory IVF lab is concerned, I think one has to be very serious about maintaining the KPIs because of the two factors. One is to achieve more and consistent pregnancies, and second is the safety for both the lab aspects as well as the clinicians as well as the embryologists. So Amin, can you please contribute something to this?
Yes. So I welcome Dr. Rajvi Mehta to present these lectures, and it's very rightly said, Dr. Mangoli sir, that we require the KPI should be observed each and every. You should have something lab directors and continuous observations, because it is so important at the end of the day. Even whatever the persistent work of the embryologist and the clinicians, if your KPIs are not, maybe the lab KPIs are not on the top, then ultimately you lose the game again. So I invite Dr. Rajvi Mehta to speak on the KPIs of the IVF lab. So welcome, Dr. Rajvi Mehta.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Vijay Mangoli and Dr. Jayesh Amin, for introducing me. And I thank Dr. Sadhna Patwardhan for inviting me to this interesting CME. And without much ado, I will directly get on to the topic of the presentation, talking about the KPIs and key performance indicators in an ART laboratory. And if we look at ART per se, we always call that the holy grail of our work has been implantation. And we've always been bothered that we embryologists grow excellent embryos, but they don't implant. And, there are two aspects to this. And Deepak has beautifully enhanced right from what they started with, he said many years ago, stating that it is the dialogue and not just the embryo or just the endometrium that make it. It's the dialogue, the crosstalk that is very important, and which is very similar. That is the dialogue and the crosstalk which is required between a clinician and an embryologist. If we don't have that, we cannot expect good success rates, because each is dependent on the other. Second thing is that another problem that we face, how do we define performance? We all feel we are doing the best, or we're not doing too good if we are very harsh on ourselves. But what is important is to get consistency in our performance and then keep raising our bar so we do better and better. And how do we go about it? And as we all know, that the factors which actually which influence the outcome of ART are all variables. Our patients are variables. They have all kinds of problems they commit. There's factor of age, there's the type of disease, the cause of infertility, the kind of stimulation given, the personnel, how well trained we are, but we cannot be the same on each and every day. So that is another variability. The laboratory facilities, equipment, processes, we can keep it constant, but still, despite all our efforts to make it constant, it is variable. And then to get a consistent performance, a constant performance despite that variability, is the greatest challenge. And therefore, we need to ensure that we have a consistent evaluation and quality assurance program to ensure that we, despite all the variables that we are working with, we do get certain amount of consistent results. And as much as we all desire, we know that none of us can get 100%. So how do we raise the bar? So if we look at the variables in an ART laboratory, it starts with the patients. Yes, the number of variability is there. I don't need to talk about it. Talk about our own laboratory. First of all, the quality of air in the laboratory, the kind of incubators that we have, the kind of maintenance, the personnel, the level of skill, the number of people. If you have a lot of cases and we have one embryologist, there is a chance of human error. And to add on the culture systems which we are using, what is the level of oil? So, and the culture medium, whose composition, we know the constituents, but we don't know the composition. So all in all, amongst these variables, something that drives us towards consistency would be a quality control and a quality assurance program, where we keep assessing the performance. Now, whose performance do we assess? We assess the performance of the individuals. We assess the performance of the equipment. We assess the performance of the processes. So every process that takes place in an ART lab has to be assessed and maintained. So whenever we talk about performance of an ART clinic or the various steps in an ART clinic, it involves evaluating them over a period of time. So it could be weekly, monthly, quarterly, and then we come to kind of conclusion of how we are doing. A performance can be assessed only by looking at the pregnancy and implantation rates. But if they vary, there are many other factors which are responsible for altering the pregnancy and implantation rates. So we need to identify that if there is any variability coming at the end of this entire process of ART, there could be something which has happened earlier, and if we identify, then we know where to work on. So we have to assess the performance over a period of time, say on the number of oocytes that have been recovered, the number of mature oocytes, the cleavage rate, fertilization, cleavage rate, blastocyst, pregnancy, and we can also look at the intermediary steps for the performance of the clinic. Now, for example, I have a new embryologist who has started ICSI, well trained, but not really gone into the clinical setup. And then we want to see what is the performance in terms of ICSI. Then what we would find that initially there is a lot of intact oocytes. If we look at intact oocytes, there is a drop. And then after a period of few months, you see that there is a sort of plateauing and there's a consistency in the number of intact oocytes. Now that is only natural because the individual does not have the acquired skills to work. They may have been trained, but skilled to work in that particular environment. And then if we look at the normal fertilization, you can see how low it was in the beginning, but then it improves and then it plateaus down. Also, if we look at fertilized oocytes, you see 1 PN oocytes, that means poor, no fertilization. You see that it becomes consistent over a period of time. So they are all interlinked based on the skill of the embryologist. Then if we look, so the indicators of quality in ART have primarily been defined by two major papers. One is the Vienna Consensus, which talks about the performance indicators in an ART lab, and the previous one, the Alpha Consensus, which talked about the cryopreservation on the ART lab. So now there are two things we are looking at. One is the competency. Means if we want to introduce something into the lab, if I want to introduce a process or make some changes in my existing lab process, I should find out that whether it is meeting a minimum standards, that what I would call as a competency or limit. If it goes below that, then I am not making a proper change, or it is not an advisable change in my existing system. And one is what I aspire to be, which is my benchmark. Ideal benchmark would be 100%, but we know that's not realistic. So we have to have a benchmark which is more realistic and gradually raise our benchmarks up. So the different indicators we look at, one is reference indicators, where we cannot directly assess whatever process we are assessing. One is the performance indicator, which we sort of record, as you know, the number of variables in an ART and the different process, the amount of data we generate is massive. But if you want to look at the data meaningfully, not in terms of research, but how our lab is doing, whether we can improve, then we look at the key performance indicators. So these are all indicators on the different stages of the procedures, but the key performance indicators are the one which determine our outcomes. So the key performance indicators would be, for example, if I were to look at reference indicators, then it indicates that we have, supposing the clinician has observed X number of follicles, then what is the number of oocytes that we have retrieved would be a reflection. So a benchmark could be that the number of follicles observed on the day of HCG or agonist trigger, we expect a benchmark of 80 to 90% of these follicles that we retrieve oocytes from them. And we expect about 75 to 90% of them to be M2 if we are denuding them for ICSI. This indicates the quality of stimulation, it indicates the ability of the embryologist. So there are a number of indirect indicators of how we perform. The performance indicators are those which we document, but we don't really look at it on a day-to-day basis. For example, IVF polyspermy, the incidence is not so high, and therefore we are not going to be looking at it so much. Maybe when we have a new person walking into the lab, a junior embryologist, if you're looking at sperm motility, post preparation, we expect it to be high. So if it is less than 90%, then obviously there's a major flaw. But in a routine basis, we are not going to be looking at this. But yes, the key performance, what we are consistently going to be looking at is the ICSI damage rate. Now, what is permissible, or what would be that one is competent with that, would be that at least we have less than 10% of the oocytes who should be damaged. If there are more than 10%, then the competency of the person who is doing the procedure is questionable, and we need that the person needs more training. Or there are many other factors which I will get to. Benchmark, we should expect less than 5% of ICSI damage. Now, if you're looking at normal fertilization rate, the expectations are near more than 80%, and more. But for competency, even if you can manage more than 65% normal fertilization, we are doing well. So similarly, we have the competency and fertilization rate for, say, normal conventional IVF. At least 60% of the conventionally or oocytes inseminated with the sperm should fertilize, and the benchmark would be 75%, and failed fertilization in IVF should be less than 5%. So this takes into consideration all the various variables that I referred to earlier. Now, what does all this monitoring lead to? How important is it? So we have now created a mean value, what we expected, what is optimal. That is what we call the benchmark. Now, for example, the KPI value is as the benchmark, and then we look at plus minus 2 standard deviations and to see how one is performing. Like I said, as much as we desire, we never have consistency with each and every procedure. There is bound to be variables, and it's important for us to note the variation that is taking place over the days, over the months. And when we monitor that, we start off seeing trends. So we see trend, for example, if you look at this case here, we see a trend that there is been a drop, and then when it reaches plus minus 2 standard deviation, it's a warning. Something's going wrong. It's going below 2 SD, and it's going still further down, means we are getting into the danger zone, and it's time to be serious to find out what is the cause for it before it becomes so bad that, by the time a lot of cases are failed and we get into a panic mode. So this way, it sort of helps us to monitor the changes that are taking place and also alerts us to an evolving problem. So we see, yes, there is a drop. It's not just flutter that is happening. And then if we find that there's a consistent improvement, then we can raise our benchmark for the lab and say, yes, we can do still better than what we are doing. So we are being optimistic in our monitoring. So for example, if we see the ICSI damage rate, the first thing that often comes to mind, and like I said in the beginning, we think it's the operator. But is it always the operator? If we are having an operator who has been giving us a consistent report, then why would suddenly that operator start giving us poorer results? So one needs to look at various factors. One is the whole thing about denudation. So I'm just taking maybe there's some problem with the hyaluronidase that has been used for denudation. Maybe it's something to do with the timing. Maybe it's something to do with the storage, or maybe something during the skill, or damage that has occurred. So is it something to do with the pipettes that are being used for ICSI for the injection, or is there a variation in the temperature and pH while working, or is it the air quality, or it could be just a change in the SOPs and which has led to an ICSI damage rate. So this is just an example. So if we find that the benchmark is 5%, the competence intense is 10%, and over a period of time, we find that this is dropping. So you cannot blame it just to the operator directly and say the embryologist is not suddenly doing well. One needs to identify the potential cause for this. And once you identify the potential cause, then there is the possibility of a solution to at least manage consistency. So if we look at the key performance indicators, so this is for ICSI, and I've talked about fertilization rate. Now, as we progress further, once the oocyte is fertilized, we do need good embryos. We need to have them develop to day 3 or blastocyst, and then we need implantation for a successful outcome. So according to the Vienna consensus, which is based on the literature and experience of many embryologists worldwide, they've come to a conclusion that fertilized oocytes, we do expect at least more than 95% to cleave on day 2. So we should not be expecting a drop in the cleaved embryos on day 2. And on day 3 also, we expect more than 70% to be the benchmark of cleaved embryos. However, blastocyst development rate, a good 40% is acceptable. It's competent, that the lab is good enough, and more than 60% is a benchmark value. As we do know that day 3 embryos growing to blastocyst very often the embryonic genome does not take over, and therefore it is nothing to do essentially with the laboratory, but it is the intrinsic quality of the oocyte, and the embryo, which is not permitting it to develop up to the blastocyst rate, and therefore we do accept a lower benchmark value as compared to that on day 3. So as I often say, that if your raw materials are not too good or not good at all, then we cannot expect good outcomes in terms of embryos. Now if we look at the implantation rate and the cleavage rates, a good benchmark would be more than 35% of implantation rate. And if you look at implantation rate with blastocysts, yes, we do know that the major hurdle of day 3 embryos becoming day 5 has been crossed, because we do get blastocysts, and therefore a good benchmark for this 60%. And all these details on the key performance indicators has been there in the Vienna consensus, and I feel that every embryologist needs to look at the Vienna consensus. So now if we look at the competence levels and the benchmark for cryopreservation, and as of now, although this was published in 2012 by the Alpha Consensus, one thing we need to realize is that now we are primarily doing we would say we are primarily working only with vitrification. Slow freezing is nearly outdated, and there will be very, very few labs that are doing it. And with vitrification, we are managing much better outcomes. So here, if you are looking at the outcome of oocyte cryopreservation with vitrification, a good competence level is 70%, and nearly 85% should be our benchmark for getting good outcomes. But if we look at it further, we will find that if we are using donor oocytes, it's not self, and they are young donors, we should have nearly a 95% survival of the oocytes just on morphological appearance. And as far as the fertilization rate is concerned, it should be about 10% less than that for fresh is acceptable. So if we go to our previous slide and we say that we have a fertilization rate of say nearly 80%, then one should expect a similar result with even cryopreservation. So we can go down by 10 units and say at least 70% is what we would expect fertilization rate with cryopreserved oocyte. As far as embryo development rate is concerned, it should be comparable with fresh embryos at the center, maybe a 10-20% lower as compared to the fresh embryos. I'm not talking about at this point of time, I'm not talking about the vitrification.
The screen is invisible.
I think we just, Dr. Rajvi got some connection issues. I'll just check with her if she could join.
In the meanwhile, if permissible, we'll take a few questions for Dr. Deepak.
I think she's connecting back. I think we should switch.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. I just seemed to logged out.
Yes, ma'am. We are having back.
Yeah, ma'am. Please.
Can you enable screen sharing?
Yes, ma'am. I am making you the host.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. So coming back. So I was talking about the oocyte key performance indicator with oocyte cryopreservation. And primarily we need to focus on the vitrification because that's what we are doing. And we expect even the embryo development rate, implantation rate, just about 10 units lesser than fresh. So all in all, it tells us that if our vitrification program is going well, then we can anticipate outcomes as good as fresh, or I would say even better than fresh in some cases, because the endometrium is not taken care of. Then if we look at the key performance indicators with blastocysts, well, good vitrification, we should get a survival rate of 80% with the blastocysts, and the benchmark can be as high as 95%. And when we talk of the transfer rate, nearly 80% should be the transfer rate for good competence, and 95%. So as you can see, the cryopreservation programs with vitrification, the expectation levels are very high because technically it is a very, very sound procedure. Vitrification, if done well, If you manage vitrification, if you do it well, then we expect good outcomes if the procedure has gone well. And as far as implantation rate, like earlier, we can expect about 10% lower than fresh blastocyst transfer. So as we can see that the implantation rates, with cryopreservation of blastocysts, embryos or oocytes, with cryopreservation, there are very high benchmarks set. Now, as it is, who sets these benchmarks? Can we be setting up the benchmark? If I have started a new lab, I cannot have these high benchmarks. I need to have a reasonable benchmark with competence and then gradually move up. But the duration within which one moves up has to be very quick, because we cannot be playing with the patient's life. Now coming to something like PGT. Now PGT in a way can be, as it becomes a more invasive kind of procedure, more technically challenging, then we need to see what should be the successful biopsy rate. And again here, the competency levels are very high, nearly 90%, and benchmark would be nearly 95%. And that would be in ability to get successful biopsy, which means ensuring we get the DNA for analysis. So coming back to finally, if you're looking at the quality control and we are talking about the quality management and monitor effectiveness of the IVF lab, we need to monitor our KPIs with the gold standards. So all the benchmarks that I mentioned, I referred to from the Vienna consensus and the Alpha consensus. All these are the gold standards. These are the benchmarks or the gold standards. And we have to measure the failed fertilization rate, the fertilization rate, the ICSI damage, the cleavage and blastocyst development rate, and the number of blastocysts that are utilized. And then we will be able to know how we are performing. I cannot study a KPI by doing a case today and then trying to monitor the key performance over a span of 1 week. You need, as I said right at the start, performance is how the results come in over a period of time. And therefore, you will be getting meaningful data for all the procedures done from day 0 to day 5 over a period of 2 to 4 weeks. The longer the period and more the consistency, we know that we are doing well. As far as the implantation rate and the ongoing pregnancy rates, naturally it will take another longer time. So we need at least 4 to 6 weeks or even longer, because if you're looking at ongoing pregnancy rates, we are going to look at the miscarriage rates, then we need to have a longer duration to understand our key performance indicators. So now if we go ahead and we try to understand, also we need to know that as much as we try, there are certain adverse events that can take place in an ART lab. For example, how many times do we manipulate the oocyte from the time we recover it from the follicular fluid till the time it is transferred? And on an average, and each oocyte or embryo is manipulated at least 20 times. So you can imagine when you're transferring it, recovering it from the follicular fluid, we're washing it, keeping it for incubation, or we are denuding it, then injecting, transferring it between dishes. Maybe even if you're doing single step culture, we are still transferring the medium, and we remove it outside for doing the PN check. So you can imagine, and then cryopreservation. So how many times, and there is a likelihood, however minuscule, of an error or an adverse event occurring. And if you're doing 100 ICSI or IVF cycles per year, we are manipulating embryos 20,000 times. We are doing at least 20,000 manipulation. And therefore, there could be certain adverse events. That could be human errors, there could be certain procedural errors, and that could, some of them may be so bad that could be a loss of complete cycle. We hope that it never happens. But yes, when you're manipulating things so many times, this could potentially be a possibility which we all wish to avoid. And the European Union, which actually makes a note of serious adverse events, found that it is most of the such adverse events happened during processing, and 35 of these were primarily human error. So yes, an equipment can fail. These things could happen, but human error is something which we also need to be considerate about. And that is the reason that ASRM and the other bodies also talk about the optimal number of embryologists that should be working in a lab depending on the number of cycles. So if you have 50 cycles or less, you need 2, because what if one of the embryologists falls sick or isn't able to make it on that day? So accordingly, one has to be prepared for these serious events and prevent it. Now so basically what is most essential is that we need to audit our labs. Auditing could be internal or external. Auditing does not require an external agency coming and looking at our data and our work. It can be done by us ourselves. So for first thing for auditing is we need to put in all the data that we have accumulated, and not just put the data into the files or the software because it is demanded that somebody has asked us to do so. We put all the data and we need to have a consistent look at that data over a period of time, how we are doing. So there's no point in just having the data, but also see how that data looks over a period of time. Are there changes? Don't believe on, our intuition, oh, I'm doing very well or I'm doing very poorly. Keep moving and be very objective. Very often, we are objective, we are scientists, but then when we come to this art of art, we tend to become subjective. We feel this could be the cause. Let's be very objective looking at this hard data, and don't look at it as an exam of how I have performed or how your juniors are performing. It's not an exam. It's something to see how we are all doing. And remember, even the embryo and endometrium talk with each other. Similarly, whatever is happening in the lab is a dialogue between all the personnel involved, and then there shouldn't be that, oh, suddenly it's dropped down, so it is so and so's fault. So basically, these audits are required, and these audits will help us start raising our benchmarks as we know that we are consistent. So in what way? Just an example of supposing you want to study the performance of an operator. Now let us look at something like a donor IUI program. And these are all young donors. So you can see it's a young donor IUI program, and therefore, we expect relatively better. And if you look at different operators over 2 periods of time, and you can see each and every operator, this operator 2 was not there earlier, it's just joined in. But you can see that when the people have been there over a period of time, there has been an improvement in their performance in terms of the pregnancy rates. So here you can see it was 8.8% pregnancy rates, did go up to 10, 9.3 went up to 11. So you can see that whenever one starts, there is scope for improvement till there is a level of plateau. And if we look at, say, the key performance indicator in the pregnancy rates, say this is again hypothetical data, so let's not go by the absolute values. But you can see that supposing the mean that was acceptable was 10, and you can see that they did manage. So this was the benchmark that was set. There were fluctuations, and then once there was an improvement, they went as high as 20. Then the benchmark was raised for the entire lab. So again, now from 11, they needed to go to 12. And then again, there was consistently little better results. So again, the benchmark was raised. So when the benchmark is raised, it's not that just because the benchmark is raised, you're going to do better, but that tells us that this is what one is capable of consistently, and that's what we aim for. So basically, all this is all comes under the part of quality management. And yes, this kind of quality management, does it work? Yes, it does work, because we find that when you're doing that, there is certain consistency that comes in. And this is exactly, say, for example, when it comes to ICSI, when a person has done, say, around X number of cycles, there is the fertilization rate is so much. And as the number of cycles increase, the fertilization consistently improved. Similarly, if you look at PGT, and you look at PGT cycles by number of ICSI cycles performed, you can see that there is an improvement in the implantation rate. And basically, like any skill job, the more you do it, more consistently you do it, you are bound to improve. But we need to bear in mind that when things become routine, there is a risk of us trying to be a little callous, because you may not be that alert and active as is with your first case. But it's important that each case, each individual, that patient's gametes and embryos that you're working on are the limited number available to the patient, and we need to show that kind of responsibility. So to end, I would really try to say that we need to use KPIs in our laboratories. It is important. We can start with the Vienna consensus and work around them. It helps us to provide systematic and early detection of outcomes. We know the trends before it gets too late, and suddenly we find that we are not having the high pregnancy rates we are getting or were expecting. So you detect it much early. So, less patients are getting affected. And then finally, you can also detect problems much earlier, and also the adverse outcomes. So finally, I would say that for a successful ART program, the most important aspect is monitoring. Monitor the outcomes, establish the outcomes you're going to monitor, monitor operator performance, not like an exam. Monitor if there are times we may have to drift slightly from the protocol, monitor what it has led to, and any kind of changes, as much as we want consistently in the highly variable setup they are working in, but we consciously also make changes. We add equipment, we need to buy some different kind of media, we alter consumables intentionally or sometimes unintentionally. So monitor what those changes are doing. And I think when we do that, we would manage to maintain consistency in the program. So thank you very much. I hope I have not gone too much ahead of time and managed to keep to the time provided to me. So thank you, and I'm open to any questions.
Absolutely not.
Thank you.
That was a fantastic talk and giving precise, still elaborative, and keeping step by step and procedure by procedure details of how the KPIs are to be, set up and then standardized. Absolutely fantastic talk. I don't think you had left anything, so any doubt in the minds of the people to ask you even the questions. Everything was so clear, made so clear.
Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Rajvi, you cleared all the doubts and showing all the fantastic internationals, all KPIs and what should be observed and what should be done in the lab. My only one questions to you: that do you feel that every lab should have one lab director?
Ideally, yes. Yes. See, what happens is that when the person is working in the lab, you may have somebody who's extremely skilled, but may not have the maturity to understand the depths of what's happening. So it is important to have a lab director who is, can foresee the problems that are coming or improve on it.
Then I will say, who will be the lab director as a post? If you are something handling, you are a clinician as a lab, then who is your lab director, who is going to monitor, and the senior embryologist who is working for since 25 years and getting all these things?
Well, the senior embryologist, if the person is competent enough, the title doesn't matter then.
Sorry, just I want to say something very practically that, sorry.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes. I'm saying that how practically lab will put a lab director to see the consistency of any embryology, any embryologist, those who are doing the work day by day. So what will be the way forward? See, it looking very good, and I think so still clinicians are doing all the jobs in the lab, and sometimes the chief embryologists are doing some way. But do you feel that some strategy should be there at India level, that should be lab director post in ICMR guidelines will require mandatory for the future?
I think ICMR guidelines do have the position of a lab director, that somebody who is responsible for what is happening in the lab. So, we cannot, you may have an experienced embryologist, and it's the question of title, it doesn't matter. But as long as there is somebody who's taking responsibility of what is happening in the lab, who is fully aware of all that is happening, who serves as a bridge between the clinicians and the embryo and all the embryos, and then back to the clinician. So there is a difference, because very often I find that the understanding of an embryologist is often as a skilled technician, and I think this understanding has to break, because an embryologist is not a skilled technician. You can get a 12th standard pass individual youngster who has extremely good hand-eye coordination, could do perfect ICSI. Fine, I have no issues to that. But at the same time, the way it is done, why it is done, that is something. So you need somebody which is much more mature and experienced, who can handle this kind of a situation. So that is the reason. So even if you have somebody, at least if you don't, your question is that there could be small clinics, small labs, and they cannot afford, or they may not find somebody who can be a lab director. Forget the finances. But if you're doing, say, 50 cases a year, who's going to sit in your clinic for that long, mature person? Well, you can do that. At least keep your data and have somebody come and audit it and have a look at it. So that can be a practical solution.
That is what I want to.
And make sure that you keep your data. Make sure that you analyze your data. If you can't do it, get somebody else to do it. That's what I would say.
That is the most important point, I think. So you have to say something that every lab should have some good software and good tracing system, that is a basic requirement that our Indian lab do not have. Still 70% lab do not have that basic infrastructure, which requires something which will trace the monthly or yearly data. And that is the basic point, that we should come out with a good software or some application system which is going to be managed, and then we can analyze all these things by a neutral agency, which might be a future be generated by some Indian organization, association, maybe ISAR, maybe IFS. They together that providing some good embryologists, those who are experienced and going to assess the lab in a better way, which will be the way forward to assess the KPIs. Isn't it right, or something you can add something more?
I would say that even if you don't want to go for fancy software, the KPIs that I referred to were not many. We are talking of say 20, 25 variables. Jot it down in your Excel sheet. That's all. Just
That's
jot it
fine, but
down and then track it.
managing one clinic is fine, but when you have a multiple clinic, then what can you do? If you have a multiple clinic, more than 10 clinics, then you should have to have some good software and good
Of
managing
course.
data. Yes, that is what
I'm talking about the least that should be there. If you have software and you
right.
can put in all that's absolutely great. And you don't even need to have external audit, because all of us, those who have a clinic, you want to do the best for your patients. So you don't essentially need an external agency. If you are
Yes.
setting your own standards, you assess yourself,
Yes,
as a
yes.
group.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rajvi. Thank you, chairpersons. I think, Bindu, you can take some questions which the speakers would be delighted to answer. Yes, Bindu, go ahead.
Okay, Dr. Deepak. So we have a few questions for you. And before we take up the questions, I would like to say, I mean, it's not like one size fits all. Like you rightly pointed out in your take-home message, that it is all about uh, selecting your patient population, standardizing protocols, and then going ahead. And with that, we have one question for you. How many hours gap is recommended in studies for IU HCG perfusion? So, what is the time gap recommended?
Sure. So because in the interest of time, I did not review all that, the precise protocols that would people go about. But the variable studies have used variable time gaps between intrauterine infusion of HCG and ET. But in general, what's been found useful is a 500 IU about an hour before doing the ET. And that seems to be sufficient to improve pregnancy rates. But people have used 6 hours to as less as 20 minutes. And there's again no data to say that which is better of the two, because then the number of studies become smaller. But on an average, I would say that about an hour should be good enough to be. I mean, that's what generally is recommended.
Would the same be recommended?
Sorry?
Would the same be recommended for GCSF as well?
No. The mechanism by which GCSF works and HCG works are very different. We must remember the GCSF is not produced by the embryo, it is produced by the endometrium, and it helps in proliferation. So we cannot, so if we start inducing GCSF at the time of receptivity, then the endometrium will go totally haywire. GCSF has to be injected at the time of OPU mainly, because that's where the endometrium is best proliferative, and it has to reach that height. So typically GCSF is either on the day of trigger or on the day of OPU, whereas HCG is on the day of ET.
One question, Deepak, when you're doing frozen transfers, so when are you, what would be the right time to instill this, GCSF or your PRP? What would be?
So again, we need to, so if it's a patient with thin endometrium, it has to be around the time of ovulation or just prior to ovulation. With service, if it's HCG, it has to be on the day of ET or a day prior to ET at the max. PRP, I'll have to look up. I don't know when people inject, but I'm told that they're generally between on the day of ET or about 2 days prior to ET. So all these molecules, because they work in very different fashion, the timings of injections are very, very different.
Could we interrelate this to not doing IVF, but could we use the same principle for IUIs?
So there are some studies where they've instilled GCSF and done IUIs, and they've seemed to got better pregnancy rates. But I'll have to look up the data to actually really look at it. I don't
find much. No,
There
couldn't
isn't
find
much.
much.
I think there's just one study which has done it that way.
Thank you.
Okay, so one point I think which everyone wishes to discuss is about GMCSF. What is your take? There are several reports where people have suggested that adding GMCSF to your embryo culture media increases the quality of your embryo in the sense that there is more blastocyst formation rate. The quality of the blastocyst is also good because of the number of ICM cells in the ICM and T cells is more. So the quality of blastocyst increases if we supplement GMCS. So would you like to comment on that?
So yes, because both GCSF and GMCSF are potent mitogens, that is, they induces mitosis in the cells and they help to grow. So in general, in blastocyst culture medium, it is one of those recommended molecules to be added. Because today's talk was more focused on the endometrial side, I did not discuss that part. But I must remind you that people have also tried GMCSF in the intrauterine instillation of GMCSF. I must remind everyone that both these molecules work in nearly same fashion. They use the same signaling pathway and they induce mitosis. GCSF just uses granulocytes, whereas GMCSF has granulocytes as well as monocytes. So there is not much difference at the level of its activity. So I think both of them should work. At the level of endometrium, there are no RCT, I mean, there are no Cochrane reviews available as yet because there are not enough studies to show its effects on endometrium.
Yeah, there is one RCT with respect to implantation. Like you rightly said, it's more about implantation potential increases with GMCSF, enriched media.
Yeah.
Now,
Yes.
I mean, I actually had assumed that you would be talking on GMCSF as well. And I had a very, I mean, I find it very weird how could GMCSF supplementation help in improving the quality of the embryo. I can understand the implantation potential. But
No, so even at the, so if when we look at the physiology of embryonic growth, the embryo, when it passes through the fallopian tube and comes to the endometrium, at that point, the endometrium is rich in GMCSF. So it acts as a mitogen again at the level of embryo, and because it synchronizes mitotic cycles in most of the cases, the blastocyst, the embryo quality would definitely improve. So it kind of acts by helping in synchronization of mitosis.
Yeah, that would be a role which is an endogenous role. How
Yes.
will supplementing GMCSF help? Because see, anti-apoptotic properties, mitogenic properties, we are aware of. Similarly,
Yes.
we know that GMCSF receptors are present in the oviduct, in the endothelial cells, even on the embryo surface,
Yes.
right? But
Yes.
then the thing is, this molecule acts via receptors. Right?
Yes.
And what I have also read is that the GMCSF receptors, it's a heterodimer. It is a big complex. And
Yes.
it's only the beta subunit which is present on the surface. So I wonder how supplementing GMCSF in the medium, I mean, you are externally adding. And it is not like an endocrine system. This is autocrine paracrine. So
Yes.
what the embryo produces and then it is released and it acts via its receptors, and therefore, yes, endogenously we can appreciate this role of GMCSF in improving embryo quality. But how would a medium supplemented externally with GMCSF, and if there are no sufficient receptors on the surface, how would it act? I mean, I could be asking a very laymanish question, but
No. I was trying to avoid this answer, but I think you're pushing me to answer this. So the frank answer is there is no mechanism by which it can act, because as you rightly said, that for GMCSF to act, you need two kinds of receptors to act on it. And one of them is not expressed on the embryo surface. So probably most of the effects that we are seeing is simply because of the glycosylated moiety of GMCSF, because it's a molecule covered with sugars, and these sugars non-specifically act on some cells, and sometimes they induce mitosis. So I don't think there is any study which has shown that when you put GMCSF on the embryos, there is activation of JAK-STAT or there is activation of MAP kinase. So I don't think there is a direct effect. At the max, it could be some indirect non-specific effects through the cell surface.
Yeah, I mean,
And
there is
again,
no
we are
RCT
forgetting
for that. Yeah.
there is no. And again,
There
we
are
must
a few
remember.
studies, but there are
Yeah.
a few studies which say that, I mean, that is how the GMCSF supplemented media, I mean, exorbitantly costly media which is being given. But then, I mean, people have to understand the mechanism by which this
So
is
the
acting.
mechanisms are not clear at all. And again, we must remember we are forgetting the thick zona pellucida. So it's unlikely that something as big as GCSF or GMCSF would even cross through that.
Cross.
So it's only probably around the time of hatching when pores are made that it might do something.
Yeah, because that is, I mean, we are talking of the pro-inflammatory process during the time of implantation, but on the embryo per se, it is unlikely to have any effect.
Yes.
Okay, because I mean, this prompted us. There was this culture medium introduced a few years back. I mean, it's around 2012 or so, and therefore we tried to see in the spent culture medium. I mean, it was a small study that we carried out, which we presented also, where we tried to see if there was any GM-CSF in the spent culture drops. I mean, when we shifted from the embryos from day 3 to day 5 for blastocyst culture, in the day 3 medium drops, we tried to estimate if there was any presence of GM-CSF. And we found that the spent culture drops which had lower amount of GM-CSF were better, which they went to the blastocyst stage. So the only explanation there could be that since it is an autocrine paracrine function, whatever was utilized by the embryo was better, and if there was more quantity, that means the embryo could not utilize. Possibly, I mean, this is no way that we could confirm it further, but then that was an indirect way. So I mean. So it's not that the embryo does not produce, and externally adding something is going to really make.
In fact, at times these could be detrimental as well, because if there's excess of GM-CSF signaling, it could trigger a lot of inflammatory response and it could be problematic.
That brings us to the next question on dose of GCSF intrauterine.
The GCSF dosages used in various studies go as low as 60 nanograms to as high as 1 microgram or 1 milligram. So there is nothing still standardized so well. People have used gel formulations, people have used injectables, people have even done IU, I mean intramuscular and IV injections, systemic. But systemic I would not at all suggest, because it's a very labile molecule. Again, it would get degraded in the liver, not really reach the endometrium. But intrauterine instillation, there is a variety of doses used and there is nothing so standard about it. People have found positive and negative effects at each of the doses. So that's where I said that there is a need for clean, well-defined RCT with a good dose, good number of sample size, and until it's multicentric, we cannot really come to a good conclusion of how well or in which conditions would it be useful.
Can we take a last question from Dr. Anita? So in case of FET for endometrium, which is not triple layer, what would you recommend, HCG or GCSF, and also the time of insertion?
So if the endometrium is not well prepared, then HCG perhaps would not really do anything, because the endometrial receptivity stage has to be reached. So in those cases, my logic tells me it has to be GCSF, but I wouldn't know much about the triple layered status. I understand the triple layer is the thickness that you would reach. And if it's reached less than 10 mm, I think the studies have shown that HCG is not really useful, because HCG is not going to induce proliferation. It's GM-CSF which is going to do, GCSF or GM-CSF which is going to do. So I think that should answer the question.
I have one question for Deepak. One question for, Deepak, correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember you mentioning earlier, not in this talk, but one of your earlier presentations, that the quality of embryo or the use of spent culture medium from good embryos initiates the changes in the endometrium, and if it's a bad embryo, then it doesn't. In fact, it stops the thing. So, you know, basically, that's where we will discuss the possibility of using group culture versus single culture, etc. Now, the question is that, that being the case, in what way are these supplements helping to facilitate either implantation or pregnancy rates? Is because if it's not so good an embryo and we are using these methods, is it that working better together? In what way are the changes occurring?
Sure. So that's a very pertinent question because endometrium is a selector activity. It inherently has the ability to differentiate between a euploid, aneuploid, or a good quality, bad quality embryo. And if it is experiencing a bad quality embryo, then it can culminate its receptivity, it will terminate its receptivity and go to menstruation. If there's a good quality embryo, it will continue the implantation to decidualization. So the question here is now that if we infuse HCG, are we pushing the endometrium a little too far to even accept a bad quality embryo? And this was one of the concerns raised by one of a very senior clinician that should that induce more miscarriage rates? But clinical studies have shown that miscarriage rates are not increased significantly, or they are not altered, implying that bad quality embryos are still not implanting with HCG infusion. Where perhaps it's happening is that there are some women in whom there is asynchronous gland and stromal development when they reach the receptive stage. So the glands have reached receptive, but the stroma has not, or vice versa. What ASGI studies have shown that by injecting HCG, it kind of brings it to that synchronized state. And in these women, it should help in improving receptivity. I don't think it's terminating the, it's not going bypassing the selector activity. So the selector activity molecules are different as compared to what HCG is, at least not the selector.
Okay, thank you.
There's another question, if we can take this. What is your stand on laser-assisted hatching? Is it really useful? If then, yes, whether zonar drilling or partial zonar removal should be preferred?
Rajvi, I think that's your domain.
Yeah, Rajvi or Vijay.
Yeah,
Vijay,
Vijay is there.
Vijay to take this
Vijay has
question.
done lots of, yeah.
Okay.
Hatching is something that is not being clear for years together, and now it is, I think, only useful in case of biopsies and you have to take out the cells and all this. But yes, in my experience, what my take on this is that assisted hatching I have been doing all the time for many years. What I have observed is assisted hatching is in selective cases, yes, it helps. Previously, particularly when we used to do a slow phasing method at that time, somehow the structure of the zona used to get slightly modified, and in those cases, we have seen slight increase and improvement after doing the assisted hatching. But now, because of the vitrification process and the molecules that are traveling with a completely different, their memory permeabilities, it is not making much difference as such. And even if you don't do any assisted hatching, you get good implantation rates equal.
I would like to add probably that rather than hatching, we could do a zona thinning in case of women, elderly women, and where we are using vitrified warm oocytes. So in that case, maybe just a thinning of zona would help, but not to all, only these selected patients.
What I observed was, even if you do assisted hatching in all the cases, it is not going to make any adverse effect. It's going to decrease the pregnancy rate, and this is the reason why many people routinely do it.
Deepak, I have one question for you. We had a very short study, last year when we were discussing perfusion of the endometrial cavity with blastogen media. And in that short study, we observed a very good implantation rate. There's been a lot of discussion, blastogen, what it has to do with the embryo, because the embryo doesn't have the receptors, as Bindu rightly said. And Bindu, I would like to tell you, we have a very short, limited data of, some poor responders and implantation failure patients whose embryos we have tried culturing, in up to blastocyst stage in blastogen media. I'm yet to publish that data of mine. It's a small study, but we have, significantly better blastocyst rate in that blastogen media. I understand, there's a lot of discussion as to if the embryo doesn't have the GM-CSF, what it is going to do to the embryo rather than it is going to work at the endometrial level. I would like also Dr. Mangoli to comment on this, the GM-CSF, the blastogen and the embryogen media. Because last year we did quite a few endometrial cavity perfusions with blastogen media. And, those patients who had failed outside, to give them a better endometrial receptivity, and we had a marginal increase in the implantation rate.
It is true that, as Deepak rightly mentioned, you need to have a multicentric and a controlled trial
Correct.
with a large, number of cases to come to a particular conclusion. And there are variations. When you do smaller studies at that time, depending upon your patient selections, there are variations, and it really becomes difficult to come to a conclusion that whether whatever negative or positive results that you are presenting, how much you can depend upon it, and how much they are reproducible. That is, I think, the main issue. What do you say, Deepak?
Yes, so absolutely true that the whole reproducibility is biggest challenge here. And when it comes to these blastogen medium, of course, as Dr. Bindu has said, that when we don't know what is there in the embryo, is it going to make a difference? So when it comes to intrauterine perfusion of these medias, the effects become completely different, because these medias also contain small amounts of these growth factors and cytokines, which seem to somehow change the endometrium. Now, what we don't know are the molecular actions of blastogen. In fact, while you were discussing, I was looking at what are the contents of the blastogen medium. I couldn't get through much. But there is a possibility that if it contains small amounts of these GCSF, GM-CSF, it might, induces very local effects, and it could improve receptivity. But again, the question is whether we are looking at women with thin endometrium, we are looking at women with recurrent implantation failures, because these, I think, are very different categories. They are not the same. The problem with most studies is we are treating everything as a single continuum, and that's where the major mistake is happening. Because I think the women with RIF achieve receptivity, but they are not able to sustain the pregnancy longer. That means the embryo, the endometrium is probably too rigid to, kind of even take good quality blastocysts and reject it immediately. Whereas women who have completely absence of implantation are the one where receptivity probably is not reached. So I think we have to, first learn to discriminate our patient population, and then stratify the data based on who is getting better, and then we will have to kind of make a better comment.
Are there any more questions?
Oh, there's one comment, ma'am, from some Dr. Jisha Varghese. I think it's related to the GCSF perfusion. She says, but in the study quoted in the talk, they have instant 2 days prior and then did the biopsy and analyzed the receptivity and pathology. Dr. Deepak?
Yes, so that was ASGI study, which they wanted to look at changes in the endometrium. So that's where they had done a biopsy after 2 days, because you want to really see a stronger effect there. But in the action of the HCG will begin and it will sustain for a good numbers of days. So even when we put in the embryo just doesn't go and start its implantation. The embryo also takes its own sweet time, and both of these activities would go parallelly. So because we cannot do a biopsy after a ET, logically, it's not ethical, and I'm sure none of you will give me a tissue after ET. So that's how the studies are planned, that we believe that all these changes would have occurred actually with the presence of embryo.
Thank you so much.
I think
there are no more questions. Yeah, there are no more questions here.
Okay, so it was a wonderful session, wonderful academic session. Thank you, speakers, Dr. Deepak Modi, Dr. Rajvi Mehta. Thank you, chairpersons, Dr. Bindu, Dr. Darshana, Dr. Amin, and Dr. Mangoli. And
thank you.
Hope to meet you again on these such wonderful academic platforms in future with your own data, with the help of Deepak now this time, and Rajvi, of course.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sadhana Madam, for including us in this wonderful session. It was a pleasure chairing the session. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Deepak. Thank you, Rajvi.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all the delegates, chairperson and speakers. Thank you, Dr. Sadhana. Thank you so much for joining.
And thank you, Aman,
Thanks.
for actually
Thanks, Aman.
hosting this so well.
Hope to meet
Thanks.
soon.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Aman. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you.
Thank you.